The Australian white ibis, Thresciornis molucca, or, more colloquially known as, the bin chicken, the tip turkey, or the rubbish raptor, is a native Australian wading bird whose distribution has recently shifted from natural wetlands towards urban habitats. Historically, the ibis was found in large populations throughout inland Australia and was rarely found in urban areas. However, widespread drought and habitat loss has forced this species to migrate from its traditional habitat to urban areas of the east coast in increasing numbers since the late 1970s, where it's now even considered a bird pest in some regions. Australian white ibis forage on both natural and artificial food sources throughout a wide variety of habitats. Natural foraging sites include marine environments such as tidal mudflats, mangrove swamps, freshwater wetlands, and rural grasslands, with a natural diet mainly consisting of terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates like crustaceans and insects. In their newly established urban habitats, ibis tend to forage at locations like zoos, waste landfills, urban parks, and streets. And while data on the diet of ibis in urban areas is limited, it is known to include a wide range of both natural and anthropogenic food items. Very few studies have compared differences in the foraging behaviours across the range of habitats occupied by ibis, and no studies have investigated the relative qualities of these habitats in relation to foraging opportunities. But in this study, the foraging success and behaviours of ibis in a range of natural and artificial habitats were assessed to better understand the exploitation of urbanised environments by this species. Additionally, the foraging behaviours and techniques of ibis were also investigated with a view of increasing knowledge of the feeding ecology of this species.
So all data was collected in the Sydney Basin region of New South Wales, Australia. Our data collection involved monitoring the foraging behaviour of ibises. We collected all data using iPhone cameras from greater than 15 metres away to avoid scaring them. We conducted observations across 4 habitat types: urban street, urban park, wetland, and rural park. Firstly, we looked at what type of foraging behaviour occurred. For the purpose of the experiment, we defined 2 types: natural foraging and scavenging. Natural foraging was where the ibises went along normally and just pecked at the ground. Scavenging was when ibises found food in non-natural sources, such as from bins or just rubbish left in the streets. The second variable that we looked at was the success or the failure of each time the ibis put its head down to the ground to look for food. We defined success as when the ibis jerks its head back and has a distinctive swallowing motion. And we defined failure as when it puts its head down, looks for food, and gets back up and doesn't swallow. The data was then compiled into various graphs and tables that were to be used in the report. Initially, we had planned to conduct one-way ANOVAs, analysing the difference between foraging type and success across the 4 different locations. But due to the size and type of our data, we were unable to do this.
So basically, the ibis preferred to forage rather than scavenge throughout the rural-urban gradient. These birds would rather stick to their natural ways, but attempt to scavenge if there's not enough food readily available. Since there are fewer creatures to prey upon in the urban street habitat, a higher proportion of these birds resorted to scavenging from bins in comparison to the other areas. However, more birds in this environment still preferred to forage rather than scavenge. In the rural park environment, the birds much preferred to catch their own food since there were more insects and worms present. The data supported our first hypothesis in that the ibis scavenge more in urban environments than in rural environments. However, the data disproved our second hypothesis that generally, ibis preferred to scavenge rather than forage.
While in urban parks, the ibis has a considerably higher rate of failure when foraging for food. Surprisingly, the ibis spent over 97.5% of its time foraging for food, while only roughly 7% of the time was spent actually eating. Previous studies also noted that the ibis spends a significant portion of its time fossicking for its food to no avail. However, It is interesting to note that when scavenging in the wetland areas, the ibis had a 100% success rate, while it only had a scavenging success of roughly 33% when in urban parks. This goes against the assumption that, in urban areas dominated by humans, there would be significantly more scraps from which the ibis would scavenge. Instead, the ibis spent more time scavenging for food in the wetland than it did scavenging in the urban park. There was also variation in the foraging success of the ibis when studying its behaviour in the wetland areas compared to the urban park. The foraging success excelled toward a third of the total time foraging. This signifies the importance of distribution variability for the Australian white ibis with respect to food availability, as well as reinforcing the notion that the behavioural preference of the ibis remains more natural, with both habitat types showing significantly more foraging compared to scavenging. In the presence of grassy areas, the ibis would rather forage for its natural diet, showing little affiliation with urban food sources such as bins. In a wetland setting, the ibis much preferred foraging due to more insects and earthworms available. This disproves a hypothesis showing that the Australian white ibis in fact prefers a more natural diet, even when in an urban setting from which food scraps are more readily available. However, future studies should consider filming more samples and for a longer period of time between various different urban parks, wetlands, streets and rural parks, so as to gain a stronger representation of the foraging behaviours of the ibis. Future studies should also incorporate the time of day into their analysis, which may have a confounding effect on the feeding habits of the ibis.
Actual results of our ibis scavenging project, the urban areas appeared to have a drastically lower foraging attempt, where the successes were very, very low in comparison, but the failures were very high, upwards of 90% failure rate. This is juxtaposed with the rural areas where the success rate was marginally higher at 30% and the failure rates were around 70%. When it came to scavenging, however, the scavenging rate of the urban areas were higher at around 20 to 30%, whereas the failures of the scavenging were around 60s. However, when it came to the rural areas such as the wetlands of the park, the wetlands had a 100% scavenging success rate, whereas the rural park had a 0% scavenging success rate, or 100% scavenging failure rate. Now, in the actual scheme of things, the amount of foraging was quite extremely high compared to the amount of scavenging per habitat. However, the urban street had a more equal results upon both, at a 70 to 30% split between foraging and scavenging. And this probably explains a little bit of an anomalic trend. It appears that ibis somewhat ignored human waste in each habitat itself. And this is just strange because that's not what we're used to.